This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Upgrade your business with Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning fewer carts going abandoned and more sales going cha-ching. So if you're into growing your business, get a commerce platform that's ready to sell wherever your customers are. Visit shopify.com to upgrade your selling today.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy.
I'm Travis Taylor, a political scientist by training with my doctorate from the University of Kentucky and a public opinion researcher by day. I'm joined today on this episode of The Politics Guys by Dr. Melissa Deckman, the author of The Politics of Gen Z, How the Youngest Voters Will Shape Our Democracy, which was released just yesterday on September 3rd. In it, Dr. Deckman tells the story of Gen Z and their political activism, noting some ahistorical trends in this upcoming generation of Americans. Dr. Deckman is the CEO of PRRI, a DC-based organization that conducts research at the intersection of politics, religion, and culture. Prior to joining PRRI, she was a professor of political science at Washington College in Maryland. She's a graduate of St. Mary's in Maryland and earned her PhD at American University in Washington, D.C. As a political scientist, her research has focused on women in politics, and she serves in a number of capacities now that advance the goal of getting more women more involved in politics. Dr. Deckman and her work have been featured in several leading national media outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, 538, and others. Welcome, Dr. Deckman, to the podcast.
Thank you for having me today. I'm really delighted to be here, Travis.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you, and it was a real joy to read your book, and I look forward to talking to you about it today. But I always like to start these episodes by allowing the listeners to just kind of get to know the guest a little bit. So I read some of your bio, but tell us more. What was your path to political science?
Well, I guess my path to political science really started in middle school years. I was one of those weird kids whose favorite show was the news. So I was always a news junkie, even back in the day when there were just three, network news. That's where you tended to get your news and information. And then in college, I pretty much knew from the beginning that I was interested in political science. Initially, I thought I wanted to go to law school, but I took a business law class as an undergraduate, and it was pretty dreadful. But I loved my political science classes, and I had some really encouraging faculty who said, you really ought to think about pursuing this in a PhD program. And because there I could really just keep writing and researching questions I was interested in. And so that was really my pathway. I went right into after undergrad, I went right into a PhD program and got my PhD in political science and worked for more than 20 years as a political science professor. And it was a great career. Along the way, however, I had this opportunity to expand my public, presence when it comes to politics by becoming the CEO of Public Religion Research Institute. I had been an affiliated scholar with PRRI for a number of years. Actually, I had served on the board and chaired the board. But really, the through lines in my research are not just about gender and politics, but also about religion and politics. And so this offered me the opportunity to really do even more research when it comes to those issues, but also to engage in public discussions about how religion and culture and gender impact American society and American politics today.
So the focus of your research is, as you said, has been not only gender and politics, but religion and politics. What got you interested in exploring those intersections between women and politics, gender and politics, religion and politics?
Yeah, sure. I was raised evangelical, and I noticed as, I became older through high school and through college, that there was more intermixing of religion and politics, especially as the Republican Party was making a lot of outreach to evangelical voters. Ronald Reagan, of course, famously, when he was running for president in 1980, he met with the National Association of Evangelicals, and he said to them, look, you can't endorse me, but I endorse you. And so that began this I think, very strong relationship through the 1980s, and of course to where we are today, between evangelicals and Republicans. And so part of, I think, my interest was kind of looking at how religion was intersecting with Republican Party politics. And when I was in college, so I graduated in 93, I was reading the paper a lot. I was reading about the Christian Coalition after Pat Robertson had run for president in 1992, trying to become the Republican nominee. And I was really fascinated to watch his organization, the Christian Coalition, really gear efforts at recruiting conservative Christians to become more active in local politics, and specifically on school board elections. And so I wrote a dissertation about the impact of the Christian right on school board elections, which became my first book. Of course, I feel like it's a full circle moment in some ways, in that we have lots of conversations about the role of religion in public schools today happening. But really, I've just been fascinated by how people decide to become involved in politics, and two, how religion or gender identity really propels some people to want to become more involved in politics. I just find these questions endlessly fascinating.
Yeah, I definitely don't think you're alone there. I think a lot of us get into political science because we have very similar questions, right, about what drives people to behave the way they do politically. And so thank you for sharing all of that background on kind of your path to where you are today.
Sure.
All right, so let's start talking about the book, and let's start simple. What's this book about? The Politics of Gen Z. What's the kind of overarching premise of this book?
Yeah, so the book, The Politics of Gen Z, is really a glimpse, I think, into the political future. And what inspired me to write the book was some data that PRI put out actually in 2018. So they did a survey with MTV in 2017 that was looking at young people's attitudes about race, about politics more generally. And one of the really interesting things about that study I noticed was that looking at patterns of political engagement, they were finding that young women were far more engaged, statistically significantly more engaged in politics than young men. And as a scholar of gender and politics for decades, this to me was really interesting because it was historically unique. And so part of the whole process for the book was to see, okay, is this gender gap actually happening, this reverse gender gap happening among Generation Z when it comes to political engagement in men and women? And why is it happening? And then what does it mean for the political future? And so I undertook my own survey research in 2019. I partnered with an organization called Ignite. Ignite is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that tries to build political ambition and political leadership skills in young women and encouraging them to run for local office. And so they were very interested in this data as well. And so I just went about and I did survey research of Gen Z Americans. And I found, again, I replicated that initial finding that PRI had uncovered in its study with MTV. And why this is notable is that historically, women have been less likely to write letters to their congressmen, to show up at local meetings, to donate money for political campaigns, to have yard signs, in their front lawns. And so really, this began to even out a bit about 15 years or so when women began to sort of be, I guess, at parity with respect to men's engagement levels in politics. And part of that was because what we know in political science is that the tools of understanding are essentially, boy, Travis, that was a lot of word salad. So I'm going to repeat that if that's okay. So
yeah, of course.
Let's stop here, So historically, we know that people who have high education levels, who work professional jobs, who have more income are more likely to participate in politics. And those sorts of features were more present among men in American political history. That began to change somewhat in about 2005, 2010, where women had caught up with men in terms of political engagement levels. But really, we've never seen a generation of women be more engaged in politics. And so what we saw during the Trump years, looking at numerous data points, including data I collected for the book, is that, in fact, there is a reverse gender gap among Generation Z women. And part of it really is driven by a couple things. So Gen Z women, have been socialized during the Trump administration. So they witnessed the historic loss of Hillary Clinton to Donald Trump, and that sort of galvanized their consciousness. They also I think, have been very much socialized by the Me Too movement, right? So in 2017, you had the explosion of an awareness about sex discrimination and sexual harassment and sexual assault. And that really, I think, led many young women to be interested in politics as well. But also in 2018, you had a generation of young women looking at, in response to Trump's election, a historic wave of women running for local office and national office, including people like AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Stacey Abrams, who was running for governor in Georgia. So for the first time, you saw lots of young women who have access to social media, who are galvanized by gender concerns, seeing young women who look relatively young. They're not the prototypical candidate running for office. So all of these things work together to propel young women's interest in politics and, in fact, led them to be more involved in politics. And it's really been fascinating to watch this development happen.
What's the purpose of the book? What were you hoping to accomplish by publishing this research?
Well, I wanted to tell a story of the influence of gender in a way that's novel and new. I've always been personally interested in encouraging young people writ large to participate in politics, I think. And I think from both sides of the aisle, I don't think that one party has all the answers to our questions. There are big questions that this generation is very cognizant about, that they want to address, whether it's tackling climate change or dealing with, mass shootings or really like trying to get ahead economically. And so talking about these issues and letting these young people speak about the reason they get involved, I think is really, really important. And it gives us a glimpse into the political future. So I did talk a lot about the survey research I conducted, but I also conducted 15 focus groups of Gen Z women, but also Gen Z men who were ideologically from all points of the spectrum. I also had a focus group of LGBTQ Zoomers. And then I spoke with more than 90 Gen Z political entrepreneurs. And so these were largely young women that I spoke with. I did, again, talk to some young men and some non-binary activists as well. But I really wanted, from their point of view, to highlight the stories of young people, especially young women who were starting their own organizations and really mobilizing and getting involved in grassroots activism. And it became very clear to me that the face of progressive activism, at least in the United States, is largely female and it's largely driven by LGBTQ Gen Zers as well. And so really it's their story, like talking to them, learning why they're passionate, what they care about, and how they envision essentially what I think will be a more inclusive democracy. And I think that's a really important and powerful story to be reminded about. In our politics, we are fixated on what was up until recently, two old guys running for president. That was really those kinds of candidates were not very exciting to Gen Z. That's changed somewhat in the last month, certainly. But trying to understand what will harness, the activism and the passion and the political engagement of young people is something I've just always been interested in. And what's really interesting, of course, with the book is that gender and sexuality is playing a big role in understanding why young people are getting involved in politics today.
So at the very beginning, you said that you wanted to tell a story and tell the story of Gen Z. Who do you want to hear that story? Who's the target audience for this book?
I think it's everyone, really, right? I think it's young people. I think it should be political activists. I would think that leaders from both parties would want to understand who these young people are and what their priorities are. One of the things I'm careful to say in the book really is you can't necessarily read all the tea leaves and think that this is the progressive values that generally are fueling a lot of young people, especially young women, are going to necessarily materialize. But I do think it's incumbent upon older Americans as well, those serving in government, those who are the leaders of our parties and organizations, to get a glimpse of what these young people care about. Because in a democracy, we try to have as many viewpoints as possible. We can't always agree on everything, but I think it's important to really understand what this very large and growing segment of the U.S. population cares about. And so my goal with the book is really to reach multiple audiences and in hopes that they'll have a better understanding of what the political priorities of this generation are.
Okay. So we've been talking about Gen Z quite a bit. Let's make sure we're all on the same page here. Who exactly is Gen Z?
Yes. So Generation Z refers to Americans born between 1997 and 2012, essentially. So in terms of generational analysis and cohorts, Demographers typically group generations in roughly 15-year demographics. Now, in some respects, that's sort of a convenient kind of a lumping of folks together. And some people are often critical of saying, well, how do we know that generation is really fueling these changes here, right? Isn't it just a function of the age cycle that maybe it's younger people tend to be more liberal overall, and maybe they'll change when they get older through the life cycle effect, those sorts of things. I still think it's a useful lens for a number of reasons. So I think in looking at Gen Z, many people who study generational politics look to how cultural changes also affect generations that will be carried over into how they view the world in the years ahead. And so with Gen Z, for example, this is really the first generation who's grown up with smartphones. And we're going to, and social media is a big aspect of the book I talk about throughout. But I think because they've experienced culture in a very different way, this really does color and shape their priorities. This is also a generation that's grown up in a very, I think, uneven or dramatic political time, right? Their political consciousness was formed when Donald Trump was elected president, and Donald Trump has really been part of their I think, their psyche when it comes to politics, really, as they become older. And so those kinds of formative exposure years, we know in political science, we call those the impressionable years. So when people form their basic ideas and orientations toward government and their values in their late teens and early adulthood, this often has a lasting impact later on in their lives. And so we know that if you start voting Democratic or Republican as a young adult, the odds are that you'll keep voting that way as you get older. Now, not everyone, of course, people certainly change, that sort of thing. But I think this generational analysis is really important because it tells you a little bit, perhaps, what the future might look like.
All right. So we're talking about a group of people who the youngest of whom are only about 12 years old still.
Right. Correct.
Okay.
And then
all right.
Up to about 26, roughly, or so. And the next generation they're referring to as Generation Alpha. So I probably will not write the book on that. I'll leave that to someone else. But so I'm just currently interested in Gen Z. I am a mom of 2 Zoomers myself. And so I think this generation is really fascinating as we're sorting through what they've been through. It's also important to recognize, too, they've also been shaped by not just social media, but really these massive sort of movements in American politics. So they're coming of age as teenagers during the climate strikes, internationally. Greta Thunberg was sort of the face of that movement, but that also spilled over into a lot of what young people here in the U.S. were concerned about. They bore witness to mass school shootings, including, of course, most notably the tragic mass shooting at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, which really propelled young people to become part of the March for Our Lives movement. In fact, I found that most of the progressive Gen Z political entrepreneurs I spoke with, really that was their first foray into organizing in politics, was through March for Our Lives. So these are very formative experiences they've had as late teens, early adults. And I think it potentially shapes what their priorities are moving ahead in the decades to come.
I want to circle back to this idea of you telling a story, because that's one thing that I really appreciated about this book, aside from just the richness of the data, and especially I'm a public opinion researcher. So you might imagine I was kind of excited about the methodological approach to the book. But just
pages of the appendix in the back. There's so many charts and figures in the back of the book.
Yes, there are. And for the academic listeners, make sure you dig into the appendix. But you told this story really through the voice of the voter and wrote it in a lot more kind of a narrative way. You balanced this academic rigor with really accessible writing. And that's impressive, especially, knowing that it's going to a university press. But so you wrote in a way that's really accessible to kind of the lay reader, the non-academic reader. But you've got that, as we talked about, that very robust appendix for the academic reader. So talk a little bit about that desire, and maybe it was kind of unintentional, but to write an academic book in a way that, as you said earlier, really is readable by anyone.
Well, thank you for acknowledging that approach. I've always, in my work, in my books at least, try to use mixed methodology, because I think that surveys tell us really interesting and fascinating things, but they don't tell us everything. You miss the nuance, you miss sort of the underlying reasons that people may be drawn to having the positions that they do. Of course, the downside of just doing qualitative work and just doing interviews is that anecdote is not necessarily the plural data is that expression. And so in my work, I've always tried to marry those two, because I think coming from both lenses, you learn a richer, more full story. And really my goal with this book was, because I wanted to influence not just the academy. I started the book while I was still a full-time academic, although I do consider myself an academic still, even as the CEO of PRI. But I recognize too that I wanted a more general reader audience as well, but I wanted to have the rigor and the receipts, right? So you can go to the appendix and look at the models. Please don't send me any hate mail about, what things I controlled for in the models. I try to make very clear why I controlled with what, for the controls that I have, et cetera. But I think combined, it tells a more rigorous story that we can be pretty confident in some of the things that we're finding. But it's not merely journalism either, right? I think it's the marriage of those two things. But I think, to meet people where they are, especially younger people, it's important to have narrative and story. And in fact, that was really something that came through in my interviews with young political entrepreneurs. This is a generation that is not getting their news and information from mainstream media, for better or for worse. And in fact, this is a generation that is often producing their own content, whether it's on TikTok, whether it's on Snapchat, whether it's on Instagram, or, on left or right websites. That's both interesting, maybe horrifying in some ways, because the disinformation that can exist is there, but also the fact that only relying on social media and news sites, often, you're basically channeled into echo chambers. You're only hearing one side of a story, which I don't think is necessarily healthy for democracy. But nonetheless, the whole point here, I do have a point, is that young people care very much about narrative. This is a very diverse generation. And young Gen Z women and young Gen Z women of color and young queer Zoomers are very cognizant that their stories aren't often told by the mainstream media. And so narrative is really key to understanding what drives a lot of Gen Z's activism. And so I think in many respects, I wanted to tell their stories because I also realized that for Gen Z activists, narrative and storytelling is really key to helping us understand why they're involved in politics today.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Upgrade your business with Shopify, home of the #1 checkout on the planet. Shop Pay boosts conversions up to 50%, meaning fewer carts going abandoned and more sales going cha-ching. So if you're into growing your business, get a commerce platform that's ready to sell wherever your customers are. Visit shopify.com to upgrade your selling today.
You talked about the mixed method approach to this, and that's something that in my daily conversations with colleagues and clients in my consulting business, I like to talk about mixed methods using a sports metaphor. So when you're watching a ball game, you don't have just the one person, the play-by-play guy sitting there talking about how many yards they've gained over the course of the game, or the statistics on this player or that player, or how many field goals or how many home runs. You also have the color commentator who's sitting there, who is usually a former player or a former coach, that is adding that commentary, is adding that color to the game, so that you're getting the numbers and the kind of play-by-play, the larger kind of picture, but you're also getting the story. And so that's the way I always like to explain mixed methods to people is, how boring would it be to watch a ball game with only one of those guys in the booth? And so when you write about public opinion research, having that mixed method approach really does tell a fuller, richer, and more exciting picture, or more exciting story.
I agree. I think that's a really good analogy. Clearly, you've never watched an Orioles game with my younger son, who is a font of statistical information. He can moneyball anything when it comes to sports. But really, I mean, watching it with my dad, who's a lifelong Orioles fan, we're having a great season. So I got to work the birds in here somehow.
That's right. Well, having your Moneyball Zoomer, coupled with like Cal Ripken Jr.
regaling us with the stories of not just Cal, right? Not just Cal, but Brooks Robinson, the greatest third baseman of all time, right? So, but I think that full story really, makes the baseball stick, but maybe it makes the politics stick. So I'm under no illusion that someone will walk away from my manuscript and my book saying, "Oh, did you see that great model she ran on Gen Z and that plot graph she had?" Which I'm very proud of that plot graph. I worked very hard in Stata to get that. but they're going to remember, Katie Eater, who is this incredible, Gen Zer who by the time she was 20 started 3 nonprofits, right? I mean, that to me is really remarkable. And I think it shows you the hopefulness of these young people and wanting to organize and affect change. Like that'll stick with you, not necessarily the model.
Right, exactly. And you do a fantastic job of telling those stories. So let's talk a little bit more about this kind of focus on women, because you've written another book on women a few years ago called Tea Party Women, in which you explore the role of women in the conservative movement, especially during those Tea Party years from the late 2000s through the early 2010s or so. And we're not going to do a deep dive on that book, but give the listeners just a kind of short summary of the research in that book.
Yeah, sure. Again, another book that used mixed methodology. So I did lots of survey data analysis to look at the extent to which the Tea Party was appealing to women nationally. And really, I didn't find necessarily lots of women supported the views of the Tea Party. But at the same time, I spent a year going to Tea Party rallies and interviewing Tea Party women who had started their own organizations or got involved in larger Tea Party organizations. And, it's really important, even though this book, the current book on Gen Z women, shows that most Gen Z women veer toward the political left. I mean, and I think are in many ways very progressive and very feminist compared to other women. But no generation is necessarily politically monolithic either. And in my current book, I do talk to some Gen Z women who are Republican and really kind of try to at least explain why they've decided to remain Republican and what drives some of their activism. But with Tea Party women, the thing that really got me interested was Sarah Palin and the Mama Grizzlies. and appeals to motherhood. Like I'm always interested how, in terms of communication, what sorts of rhetoric and what sorts of imagery and reasons that people give for wanting to participate in politics. And historically, this is really going way back. Women, of course, have not been involved in politics historically, but when it came to kids, even in the 19th century, right, the temperance movement, the rationale was, well, these are mothers trying to protect their kids from the dangers of alcoholism, right? Or, so there was always kind of the rationale for women to become involved in politics, even in eras where that was very impolite, was often extended to women if it involved children and motherhood, right? That kind of motherhood rhetoric is really, really important. And you saw it really all over the place with Tea Party women who were talking about, and Sarah Palin and the Mama Grizzlies, and wanting to protect their kids from too much excessive government debt, for example, and things like that. I was also really just fascinated by Palin's candidacy because, we can talk about whether she was good or bad for the ticket. And many people look at Palin's candidacy as a mistake that John McCain had made. But she really, for the first time, I think, represented many women who didn't feel that they had been represented in American politics. So you had women who were against abortion. Here was someone, the governor of Alaska, who had a special needs kid, right? She was very, very much pro-life. And that resonated with a lot of these women. She was pro-gun. She was, gorgeous. I mean, she was like on this national stage, I think, giving a platform for a lot of these women who felt that they hadn't been represented before. And I thought that was a really interesting story to try to unpack that. At the same time, it is true, nationally speaking, looking at the national survey data that I looked at, including data from PRI, which I had great access to, the goals and policies of the Tea Party when it comes to cutting social services, cutting taxes, against abortion, this was not something that most American women supported. And so the Tea Party, I think, had some limits with respect to expanding its reach among American women more broadly, because the goals that they espoused were not necessarily ones shared by most American women, even a decade ago.
So you said something in that discussion of Sarah Palin that struck me as kind of a parallel to your current book, and that's the idea of representative. Like Sarah, you said that women looked at Sarah Palin and saw a representation of themselves, so that they've never seen in politics before. And you talk about that
conservative women who often rejected, feminism, right? Like I support women's equality, but those feminists are too extreme, that sort of thing. And that was very much prevalent among the women I spoke with who were part of the Tea Party. I'm sorry to interrupt, but yeah, exactly.
No, that's okay. And you talk about that a lot in this book as well, that Gen Z women are now seeing people like AOC and other members of the squad that look like them. This concept that we political scientists call descriptive representation. I'll let you talk a little bit about that and explain what that is. But I'm struck by kind of the similarities in being driven to political activism by that descriptive representation. But then also, what differences did you see between, because you've got this historical context over the last 20 years or so since the Tea Party movement to today of studying Gen Z women. What are the differences that you see?
That's a good question. The irony, I think, for conservative women who were active in the Tea Party is that Sarah Palin for them was a very compelling figure who represented something new in American politics. The irony is that, however, you had many conservative women who would reject the idea that identity politics were unimportant, right? So were important rather. And so, even though the feminist movement, the second wave women's movement, really allowed the doors to be open for a lot of the women I talked with in the Tea Party, like a lot of those women activists I talked with in the Tea Party were small business owners. They were college educated. They had successful careers, right? But they hated feminism, right? But so, that was kind of not lost on me that even though these doors opened for these women who could become, engaged in politics in ways that were really interesting, there was still a reluctance to say, well, gender mattered, right? Many of them would say to me, no, well, gender doesn't matter at all. Even though I was talking about Tea Party women, they're like, well, that's not as important, right? We're just committed as conservative activists and our gender doesn't really matter at all. I think the big thing with Generation Z, and especially with the Gen Z women and LGBTQ activists I talked with, is that identity is really critical for understanding a lot of their engagement, especially on the progressive front, right? This Gen Z women are powering the surge in progressive activism in part because they really want to have a democracy that's far more inclusive. And when we talk about inclusivity, it's not just gender, it's LGBTQ status, but it's also race and ethnicity. I think it's really important to remember, and a lot of Americans don't realize this, but Gen Z is the most racially, ethnically diverse generation. Roughly 1 in 2 Gen Zers are not white or non-white. And so this is, again, one of those generational markers, right? Like I'm Gen X, I grew up in a very rural county in Maryland with very few people of color. But my kids' generation, they're going to high school that are far more racially diverse and ethnically diverse. So they're seeing and engaging with people on a day-to-day basis where that looks a lot like America. But yet our political system still has disproportionately old white guys involved, right? My editor would not let me, but I wanted to call this book No More Old White Guys, but he wouldn't let me do it. But there's a sense with Gen Z.
I think you snuck that into one of the chapters.
It's a chapter title, right? But I heard that a lot among the women that I spoke with, the Gen Z women I spoke with. But I think, though, that's a very key distinction from women in the Tea Party movement, right? Who were middle-aged and business owners and wanted smaller taxes and smaller government. Whereas with Gen Z women, identity is really important to how they understand the world. And really their commitment to having a democracy that looks like America, that looks like them, that's more representative. So the idea of having a more racially diverse, multi-religious democracy, pluralistic democracy, that's really, really important to many of the Gen Z activists I talk with, those especially on the political left.
Do you see that conservative Gen Z women are more like their generational counterparts in that they see gender as important, or are they more like their ideological counterparts from the Tea Party era where gender is not important to them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I do talk in the book. I conducted focus groups with Gen Z women who are Republican or Republican leaning. And I talked to some Gen Z Republican activist. It's interesting. I think that many of them still do not necessarily want to talk about gender as an important part of their identity per se and driving their activism. I found when I talked to many of the Gen Z women in my book, what led many of them to remain Republican is that they're staunchly against abortion, and many of them are religious. And so that's part of why that kept them in the Republican Party. Some are ardent gun rights activists, so they are committed to gun rights. Some of them also really are very kind of the more classic libertarian small government. Like we want government out of our bedrooms, but also we want lower taxes, that sort of thing. And so, but I think in terms of the importance of identity politics, I think many of the Republicans I spoke with, young men and especially young men, would reject that, who are involved in conservative activism, I would say. That, in fact, it was almost sort of countercultural, right? Because they recognize, and of course, bear in mind, many of the Republicans I spoke with were on college campuses. So they were very acutely aware that their viewpoints weren't necessarily the most popular ones on campus. And I think some of them really were resentful of that. At the same time, though, I did speak to some Gen Z women who were women of color and some Gen Z men who were Republicans who were men of color. Not a lot, right? Because the data just show that there aren't a lot. But, they did recognize that the future of their party was really imperiled by the fact that the GOP was not making inroads to a lot of these groups and perhaps maybe moderating in some positions. So for some Gen Z Republicans, they do recognize that that's a problem. I think the current iteration of the GOP is not necessarily doing anything to address that. And certainly, I think the MAGA movement, they are gunning for young conservative men, right? This election cycle, and talking about the left's war on masculinity is something you hear a lot from Republican Party circles. But I don't see any movement by the current iteration of the GOP to get more young women on board the Republican train by any stretch. I mean, I just feel like Gen Z women are not buying what the GOP is selling right now at all.
Okay. So let's dig into this partisan divide a little bit. So the Gen Z is more progressive, is more liberal. By how much?
Yeah. So if we look at, actually Public Religion Research Institute, my organization, did a big survey of Gen Z that came out in January of this year. In fact, we have some more recent data than some of the surveys that I had collected. And so we found among Gen Z women, I think roughly 41% self-identified as liberal, and so plurality of Gen Z women identify as liberal. They're very, very much unlikely to say that they are conservative, though. Whereas with Gen Z men, so the trend is really that they're moderate to liberal and progressive, but on policy positions such as support for LGBTQ rights or reproductive rights or racial equality, they really tend to veer far more progressive and liberal than other American women. And certainly, I think more than their male counterparts. But Gen Z men, I think there's a narrative right now suggesting that Gen Z men have become far more conservative in reaction to Gen Z women's strident feminism. I don't think the data support that necessarily. Gen Z men tend to be more ideologically diverse than Gen Z women, I would say. Even in that study that we put out in January, we found that the plurality position for Gen Z men is more moderate, but they're more likely to say they're liberal rather than conservative by a few points. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. There are, I think, there's some data showing Gen Z men who are white maybe leaning a bit more conservative. But again, remember that half of Gen Z men are men of color, young men of color. And so they tend to be more, if not progressive, at least more moderate than white young men. And they care about things like gender, like racial equality, for example, more than young white men.
Okay. So you talked a minute ago about the current iteration of the Republican Party. So let's fast forward, maybe it's 6 months, maybe it's 6 years. What can conservatives, the Republican Party, do to attract more members of Gen Z, especially those younger women?
Yeah. Well, I think that they're going to have to change their policies with respect to reproductive rights. So we now have a situation in many red states where abortion has effectively been banned or severely limited. And we know at PRI, we routinely poll on Americans' attitudes about reproductive rights. And we find in no state, and we have state level data, all 50 states, in no state do more than 14% of residents support a ban on abortion. And so this is a position in these state legislatures that have been passed that really does not reflect public opinion remotely. And for Gen Z women in particular, who are the most staunchly supportive of reproductive rights, this is really a non-starter for many of them. I think we saw in wake of the Dobbs decision that it was Gen Z women voters in 2022 that really mitigated some of the red wave that people were anticipating with the midterms, because they really turned out in higher numbers. And in fact, 72% of Gen Z women voters, and if you look at the generic House ballot, voted for the Democratic Party. So 72%, that's very, very, very high. So one of the things I think the GOP would have to do is to be willing to become more moderate on abortion. I don't see that's happening anytime soon, but that would be one thing. They'd also have to be more moderate on LGBTQ rights. I think that the GOP has recognized that Americans are more ambivalent or uncertain about transgender rights. And so that's been a wedge issue that I think they've pretty successfully, used in terms of some politics, has really ginned up their base. But Gen Z women tend to be far more supportive of LGBT rights, including the rights of transgender and non-binary Americans. And so there'd have to be, I think, among the GOP, a recognition to kind of think about rights in ways that are the rights of LGBTQ individuals. And lastly, on diversity, right? I mean, you have red state Republicans like Ron DeSantis who have essentially stopped, conversations about teaching about racial history. And yet Gen Z women, by and large, are committed to racial equality. And so on those cultural issues, the GOP, I think, would have to moderate. And I don't see them doing it anytime soon. But I think if they want the votes of young women going in the future, and they're going to become a bigger and bigger part of the electorate, I think on those cultural issues, there has to be some sort of, I think, change or moderation. So
to attract young women, the Republican Party needs to become the Democratic Party of yesteryear.
Or not a party right?
I say that tongue in cheek, but it sounds like with the Democratic Party shifting more to the left, that the Republican Party needs to follow it. And again, maybe not as far left as the Democratic Party is willing to go, but it sounds like the Republican Party, to attract this next generation, does need to move to the left. Is that what you're seeing?
I would think it needs to move to the center at the very least, right? I mean, I think the GOP has become, far more conservative on a host of issues, and really in ways that don't reflect national public opinion. It reflects the base of the movement. It reflects the influence of the MAGA movement, right? I think another thing to kind of bring it back to religion, we haven't talked much about religion, but Gen Z women are less religious than Gen Z men. We find in our data at PRI that about 38% of Gen Zers are unaffiliated. And it's because, in fact, we see, I think, Christian nationalism becoming a bigger part of the GOP. It's in response to younger people being less religious, to younger Americans adopting identity as LGBTQ, to really, the more, I think, racial diversity among young people. So I think for many older white Americans who are Republican, they're seeing an America they're not comfortable with, they're not familiar with. And so I think that, the lack of religion for some among Gen Z, in fact, has sparked this kind of reactionary politics on the political right. I do want to say this. It's not as though there aren't ways for the Republican Party to attract both young men and young women. I think they seem to be doing a little bit of a better job with young men currently. But, economic anxiety is still the number one issue that is motivating Generation Z. And so, I think if the GOP were also willing, for example, to come up with programs that would forgive student loans, this is a huge burden on many Gen Zers. Not all Gen Zers go to college, but this is something that we found in our research, and we did focus groups for this part of this larger Generation Z project that we put out and survey report that we put out. And so, economic anxiety is a through point, regardless of the focus groups we had, whether they were Democrats, Republicans, women, or men. And so there is a lot of anxiety about about how their generation is going to get ahead. There's a feeling that they're not going to do better than their parents. And so I think both parties need to think about economically how to appeal to those individuals. But I think with the current iteration of the Republican Party, tax cuts to billionaires are not necessarily going to be that appealing to a lot of members of Generation Z, especially younger women.
All right. So what's the future of American politics? I mean, based on what you're seeing with Gen Z, what should we be looking to happen? I'm going to ask you to forecast here a little bit, but
so I make Travis, predicting the future. After 20,
but you've got the data, you've got the knowledge. Tell us, like, what's gonna happen when this new generation matures, when the younger ones become of voting age, and they start replacing previous generations in positions of elected leadership?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like, what is the crystal ball telling us here? Well, I think what's notable about Generation Z is that if they care passionately about something, they're willing to turn out and vote. Now, they still don't vote as much as older people, right? The last 3 election cycles, 2018, 2020, 2022, we saw record level voter turnout compared to decades previous with Generation Z. But even in 2020, in that election, that very critical election in American history, it was only 50% of eligible voters. So I think part of the challenge is still making sure that non-voters, people who are disaffected, and there's lots of data showing Gen Z is just completely tuned out on lots of areas, getting those folks to become more involved is going to be, I think, really important. But let's say that the trajectory is, Gen Z becomes older, they're voting more. I think based on current trajectories, you could expect the Democratic Party to do better. I think the downside for the Democrats, of course, I don't know if it's a downside, but it's a structural issue, is that, we have a very decentralized system of American government. And so we have red states that are firmly in control of, the Republican Party. Blue states, of course, are overwhelmingly Democrat. And so, having that change come about, it's not going to happen overnight. And so I think that's something to kind of think about moving forward. I think the big danger, a lot of people might argue, well, demography is destiny. And, I think it helps us maybe predict some things. But one of the things I noted with especially the most progressive activists is really a sense of impatience and a burning out, right? And so some of the women I spoke with who started their own groups, they had them going for 2 to 3 years, and then they just got tired because, they're teenagers or young adults and they've got to do other things in their lives. And I think there's a sense of frustration among some of the most progressive that party politics is futile because the changes they'd really like to see are going to happen by the parties. And so, do the Democrats take these voters for granted? So it's not necessarily, I think, a given that, the Democratic Party keeps going in a leftward trajectory and that those voters are going to be there for them. But we'll have to see. We'll have to see how it turns out. But I think based on the data we see now, I think that Generation Z is going to be voting more for Democrats in the near future, especially Gen Z women and LGBTQ Zoomers. And of course, I didn't even mention this, but like 1 in 4 Zoomers identifies LGBTQ. And they're the most staunchly Democratic, I think, of any group of Zoomers in the data.
So if you could have listeners close this episode and walk away from this episode of the Politics Guys with just 1 or 2 kind of critical takeaways, what would they be?
Well, I think that a critical takeaway is that the future in politics is probably female, right? And this is a very different trajectory than what we've seen in history. And I think that's really interesting and potentially encouraging. I think that in a democracy, having the voices and talents of all individuals is really important. And I think with Gen Z, you have representation of different groups that we haven't seen before. And I think that's really an exciting trend. So I think that's important. I think the other takeaway is, again, we can't necessarily assume that because Gen Z is very much involved in this progressive activism currently, that they're going to keep, that gas on the pedal. And so finding ways to keep Gen Z engaged in politics is important. But also, again, no generation is monolithic politically. And so I think it's important to think about, bringing in voices that are a range of values and bring a range of values and perspective. I think that's really important in a democracy. And so that'll be something to keep our eye on as we move forward as well.
All right, Melissa, thank you for joining me today on the Politics Guys, and thanks for the opportunity to read this new book.
Thank you so much, Travis. I really appreciated the conversation.
I did too. Thanks for joining us. Again, that was PRRI CEO and political scientist Dr. Melissa Deckman on her new book, The Politics of Gen Z, How the Youngest Voters Will Shape Our Democracy. And it's available right now wherever you buy books. That ends this interview episode of The Politics Guys. If you're not a supporter of The Politics Guys, if you want to have more interviews with amazing authors like Dr. Deckman, you should become a supporter. Supporting the show gives you access to all kinds of benefits, like access to these episodes without any of the advertisements or any of the interruptions. But there's so much more to being a supporter of The Politics Guys. It includes being a part of our very active Discord group and all kinds of other benefits. So if you want to support great interviews like this one on the politics of Gen Z, head on over to patreon.com/politicsguys right now. Take a look at the different levels of support and the different options you'll have to support the show, support the mission, and support the guys behind the podcast. Again, go to patreon.com/politicsguys because shows like this are only possible with your support. If you'd like to support us in other ways, we're on Venmo at Politics Guys, and you can also support the show through PayPal. All of these support links are in the show notes as well as at politicsguys.com/support. If you want to buy the book, The Politics of Gen Z, you'll also find a link to do so in those show notes. If you want to be any kind of member, but you just can't support us right now, we totally get that. We'd still love to have you share, subscribe, rate, and review this episode in whichever podcast app you use and on social media. If you've got a question, comment, correction, anything else you'd like to ask us about the book, the interview, or anything else we do at The Politics Guys, please drop us a line at mail@politicsguys.com. You can also reach us on Facebook and X. You can find all of those links, you guessed it, right there in the show notes. I'd like to give a huge thank you to our executive producers of The Politics Guys, Bruce Johnson, Wilma Marina, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, and Don Oglesby. And of course, a special thank you goes out to all of you, our listeners. The other guys will be back this weekend with a full episode, and I hope you'll join us then.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.